And these two talks, I think it's already raised a lot of the issues. Let me start with some brief comments on Alexander's the talk. I think your summary of the communist legacy of the Russian Revolution. In the first four, you focus on the social creativity. It's different from many other issues. When we talk about the legacy of socialism here and there, we focus on the property issues. You also talk about property issues, but you focus on the social creativity. Obviously, against what's the enemy of that? You talk about the conformism plus the bureaucracy, which killed the Soviet Union actually, and killed continuously different social creativity. So that's, I think, it's very important lesson. The second, some rhetoric for me, it's also interesting. Nowadays, not so many social scientists continue to use this rhetoric. For example, the heroic, the heroism, sacrifice, and to be killed, you are voluntarily to be killed for something. So that's the heroic. That's also the feature of the 20th century revolution. I think it's here and there, not only a Russian revolution, but also the Chinese revolution or other revolutions. It's very different from the current, you can say, the spirit of time. Maybe we can recall that legacy. I think it's very important. Third one, I think you focus on the culture is also very important. For many aspects, that sometimes we also think about the failure of the 20th century socialism came from not so much, it's actually a lot, but still not enough. We're defeated by some other dominant conformist culture, for example. So, but anyway, which remind us the rich legacy and the tradition of the socialism in the culture sphere and the cultural field, partly because of culture, and also when you talk about the social creativity, you had to talk about the culture. So that's two things linked together. And also, of course, the property for everybody. So which remind of the social purpose. And not only the social form, but also the essence of that, the social form. So you also talk about the essential and the formal distinction between these two. Even you have formally, you have some forms, looks like the socialism, communism, but sometimes became empty. So that's the issue. And also both of you will talk about the contradictions, and not only in the past, but also in the contemporary context, because we are living in the contradictory the situation. So how that's maybe there's also the reason why we try to think about the legacy of the socialism, because when we talk about the contradiction, we need to rethink about the orientation of further reform, or as you as Boris also mentioned, that what we need a kind of the new revolution is more urgent for us. Partly these legacy imply what kind of the essence or what kind of the content of that new revolution in contemporary world. I think this is all the important. And also in Boris' talk, I think he talked about the popularity of Lenin, but and also, of course, even more popular, the Stalin. And it's, of course, different explanations for us: nationalism or some others, social equality, and so forth. But on the other hand, I think that the memory about the socialism was part of the reason. So here in China, it's the same, with a lot of the memory about Mao and the socialist era became part of the popular culture. Maybe compared to other countries, Chinese culture in a descriptive level, if you look at the popular culture, so many elements from the 20th century still as a living the culture here in China. That's, I think, different, massively existence, I think. So here I want to maybe make some comments on from Chinese sides too, because China also living in a kind of the complicated relations of contradiction, different contradictions, and how to understand the Chinese society. Obviously, different judgments. Some basic from how to define China. I think there were two kind of course, different. But generally speaking, we can find the two judgments. One is the mainstream in the Western media. Sometimes, ironically, it's also in the Chinese mainstream. They are oppositional, but to some extent, they try to define China as a socialist country, but some were negative way or the positive way. And these are whether or not how to define that, we can talk about later. And on the other hand, many people, like some left-wing intellectuals and the socialists or the anarchists, they just perceive China from the beginning even as a state capitalism. Or some people will argue that it's almost a normal capitalism, partly because the market's mechanism already penetrated into every corner of the society, and so on. Only the exception was the role of the state. It's different. And some others, of course, try to argue that China is still not normal the capitalism, partly because the party's role and so on and so forth. Here it's so how to judge that is that maybe we can summarize some different views from left-wing intellectuals, all the scholars, all the activists, to define China as not a full capitalism. For example, Samir Amin, he argued that only if China didn't carry out the full privatization of land, then the actual public relations are still containing some elements of the socialism. So that's so from that, the arguments he talked about these. But on the other hand, we also know that now even the land didn't fully privatized, but more free circulation in the market condition. How to define it is still the difficult question. So this is one of the arguments. The second argument is still also contradictory, because a lot of people argue that the percentage of the national property rights, still a lot of the properties owned by the state. So that's also especially during the high wave of the neoliberal capitalism, globalization, neoliberal capitalism, how to explain why China achieved its development. So some people attribute that achievement to the existence of the large-scale national property. So that's the other. That's somewhere maybe it's important. For example, without that, it's difficult to think about the property reduction campaign, especially for the tax reform, that for the transferable pay for the poor areas, still that's matters. But on the other hand, well, some people will argue that national enterprises, state-owned enterprises, still working inside of the global capitalism. So, and then maybe some elements, still like universities, research institutes were based on the traditional framework of the state. So that's, but on the other hand, the last decades, it's on the transformation, how to do it. But the fourth element, I think, is important, which had a deep connection with the socialist tradition. It's also related to the Alexander's arguments about the social creativity, but in a different ways, because social demand. It's it's a lot of the social movements were still, the social issues demand was still appear to the socialist legacy. In the early years, when the larger scale privatization of the state-owned enterprises in the late 19th and early years of the 21st century, a lot of the workers' movements actually appeal to the socialist legacy. And even if you look at different demands for the rights, the civil rights, actually still different from the liberal tradition. They appeal to the socialist tradition, which also means that the socialist culture still have some impact on the social mentality. And so in that sense, in this way, the socialist legacy is still the living legacy for China, partly because without these kind of the social demand for the socialism and the responses from the social the state policy was also to some extent it was decisive to the direction of the responses from the social policies. So in that sense, well, still I think that the Chinese the revolution was still matter very important legacy in contemporary context. And even in the culture field, a lot of the stories here where younger generation became enthusiastic for that, of course, in different ways. So these are some comparisons between the different conditions. From these kind of the issue, I talk about China partly because when we evaluate the significance and of Russian Revolution, I think you have different perspectives. One perspective was inside of Russia. We can understand what's developments from October Revolution and developed from the stage of Lenin's time and the Stalin time and the post-Stalin time and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we can also understand or interpret the Russian Revolution from global perspectives. So national liberation movements and different revolutions after the Russian revolutions, it's difficult to, without rethinking about the Russian Revolution, it's difficult to understand these global changes. So I completely agree with that. These Russian Revolution is a revolution which has changed whole world. So that's a global situation. It's create some new world history in the 20th century. But even though not only after the failure of the socialist system, I mean the end of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European systems, but still how to rethink about the new global system. We need to rethink about that revolution era and its legacy. So that's, I think it's the comments, because I just listened to your talks. I didn't read any documents from you, but I think I really learned from your talks. So I made these kind of the comments for that. Another question, maybe I want to raise some comments about you that how can you relink the Russian Revolution in the 20th century and other spheres? Basically, you mentioned that, for example, the different revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, 20th century revolution, it's different from early revolution, partly because all these revolutions happened in the peripheral areas. It's not the center of the capitalism. So afterwards, maybe it didn't achieve the goals of the socialist revolution, but it transformed the society in some ways. And for example, defeat the colonialism, imperialism at that time. So that creates some conditions for the further developments, for the new stage for these countries, for their new experiments. So in that sense, still we can rethink about the legacy in the context of the peripheral areas like Asia, Latin American, and Africa. So these are the one question. The second is that you also mentioned, you both of you also mentioned that the nature of the society, Russian society today, and is a combination of the contradictory combination, oligarchy system, feudal and nuclear militarization, and so on and so forth. So in these kind of the structure, and what kind of how do you evaluate the importance of that the socialist legacy for the mobilized the people, I mean, for their social creativity? To what extent are you still the pessimistic or the optimistic, or maybe these are two simple binaries? But in any case, if we look at it in the future, we still need to understand to what extent this legacy is still living. So it's important, but it's whether or not it's still the living legacy for us for the further reform. I just stop here for your brief the response, and then maybe we open for more discussions.
So first of all, thank you for your comments. And when you feel that your presentation can be understood, that you understand what I want to say from the heart, not only from my brains, this is very important, especially some rhetoric aspects. I can say maybe stylistic, but it is not stylistic problem. It is not problem of style. It is a problem of content. Also, I want to stress that in China, of course, there are a lot of examples of the same heroic enthusiasm, social creativity, and so on. I was many times in China, and when we are coming, we all time are trying to understand the atmosphere of life in your country. And we watch TV. In Russia, I'm trying not to watch TV. In China, I try to do this. And there is a very big difference. In some channels, often, you have old movies, black and white, and I cannot understand Chinese, but I understand the content of the events because of the behavior, because of the very high level of actors who are trying to show what they're doing and so on. Intonations. My English is not very good for cultural debates. But when we were watching modern Chinese movie, unfortunately, I also could understand nearly everything because it was just a copy of Hollywood blockbusters. More or less the same, but only Chinese language and Chinese faces, but bim, bim, and something like that. Yeah. Of course, there are some new interesting cultural events. Why I said about this? Because I think now for China and for every other country, any other country, key question is this integration of social creativity with integration, including in the cultural life. In some aspects in China, I saw in other forms, which I think came from the past. I don't know, Mao period or maybe earlier period, when people are singing together in the streets. And it's very typical in many different cities. We were in maybe 10, 15 cities in China. And this is tradition nearly everywhere. And not only old generation. And maybe this is simply cultural tradition. But I think there is something from collectivism, from solidarity. And in behavior of many Chinese people, I met this solidarity trend. I think for many people, word comrade was not something impossible. And even in Russia now, for many people, this is something impossible. In the West, this is very strange for absolute majority. Even among the left, not often you will use this word. So that's why I think China has socialism, not in economic relations where maybe private corporations and market relations are dominant, but in some forms of spiritual life, in some cultural traditions, in values of the people, in forms of solidarity. I don't think that this is 90% or 100% values of the Chinese people, but it is still alive. And when I was talking with students, not only with old generation, there is also very visible division. Maybe big part, I cannot say the biggest, but big part will just take from you something useful for career, for future work and so on. But part of students are trying to find the really important, essential cultural values which are far from money, commodity fetishism, and so on. That's why I think in China, legacy of your revolution, legacy of your heroic results in past and now are still alive. And if your intellectual life will maybe stress these aspects more than formal characteristics, I think it can be important. I cannot give you advice, of course, but I talk about this everywhere in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and especially in Russia and former Soviet states. And I think we can have this reflection from below on these aspects even more than in some economic and political spheres. And one of the aspects, I think, of our political struggle is also interconnected with the problem of absence of values understandable for ordinary people. I will use one economic data because in some aspects I'm still economist, not only Marxist and so on. And I want to stress that in Russia, 50% of population have a wage less than 30,000 rubles. 30,000 rubles, according to official course, is 300 euro, maybe 350 dollars per month. This is not big money. If we take into account purchasing power, maybe it will be more. Of course, in China, there are a lot of people who are more poor, but Russia was a developed country, and such situation in our country is catastrophe. It's result of terrible economic, stupid, and very antisocial, asocial economic policy. And as a result of that, we have what big part of population who are living or surviving in bad conditions. And for these people, this is one of the paradox. When you're talking about growth of incomes, they will say, yes, this is important. But when you are starting to talk about big values, country, social justice, progress, real progress, humanization of relations, even social alienation and overcoming of social alienation, disalienation, they understand you. One of the paradoxes of our media is this opportunity to tell a few words even for the left. And on one of the channels, not very popular, but still social television of Russia, I have every week 25 minutes of open air in the evening with telephone communication with people. And what I said now is a reflection of this 1 month talks with different ordinary people through television. That's why I think in our debates in social science, we must move a little bit from formal characteristics reflected in official statistic to more deep, more essential, and at the same time more contradictory processes and relations. Thank you so much.
you mentioned these certain kind of the angle for the reflection from below, but I actually agree with that. But want to put further, it's like the slogan. Some people will mention that because in Christian tradition they talk about the transcendence, upward, but revolutionary transcendence was downward and create the social creativity. So that's a mass. It's not from below. Mass is a subjectivity. It's a real
Great,
social subjectivity.
absolutely great
So
reflection.
that's not only the below, and because when we think about the mass from below, it's always a structure for the different social class. The revolution was to change the whole social structure. So that's why the transcendence downward and create the new social subjectivity is real the revolutionary culture. I think that's the function of that. It's very, and now we have some questions. Maybe when Boris is not here right now, so with the question
Boris is here.
is here. So the Boris, maybe the first question is for you. The one is Zhang Weili. He or she mentioned that, can I get more elaborations on why Professor Boris KARGARLITSKY said after the collapse of USSR, those scholars had to leave the country?
Well, you see, it is very interesting how in Russia deindustrialization was linked to the destruction of science and education, because, well, in more general terms, I think this is a neoliberal tendency everywhere, and we saw deindustrialization even in the United States of America, in Britain. However, these countries being part of the core of the capitalist system, being also the place where major corporations have their research and development facilities, retained much of their scientific capacity, though, of course, everybody who works in practical science in the United States or Britain or even in France, where the situation is somewhat better, complains about their actual degeneration of management of science, the generation of values. You see this neoliberal approach to science, which is destructive everywhere, because also this is a so-called project approach. So you have to be efficient in market terms, in terms of timing. So it's not about just looking for their the truth, for their knowledge, for the objective truth. It's more about doing certain things, achieving them within a certain amount of time, within a certain budget, and so on and so on. So in that sense, everywhere in the world, not only in Russia, everywhere in the world, science, including natural science, faces quite a few problems. However, given the specific situation of capitalist core in the countries of the center, in the countries of the core, these problems, no matter how important, still are not developing to the level when they actually kill the capacity of the country or of the research institution to do research. They're still capable of doing research, and at least there is money. There is a lot of money. This money is often used in a very inefficient way from the scientific point of view, because there is a clear contradiction between the logic of the market and the logic of science and the logic of knowledge. But still, there is money. In case of Russia, we have all these advantages, quote unquote, these characteristics of neoliberalism, combined with a tremendous peripheralization of Russian economy and society, and tremendous degeneration of Russian elites. And that means that there is just no money for science. in the sense that Russian elite doesn't see any need to have this gigantic scientific apparatus which it inherited from the Soviet Union. It's much more profitable in Russian context, for example, to kick out a laboratory and to rent out a building, or even to pull down the building to build something new. And this is the way to make real estate market work. They clearly don't need to have so many universities because we don't have much of industry anymore. So why should we have so many educated people? Because industry generates demand for knowledge. And we don't even have big multinational corporations which are in anything but raw materials. Well, with one or two exceptions. One exception is Rosatom, so atomic energy and nuclear power plants and so on. So they still need scientists, and that's why, by the way, physics we have in training and research in physics is, of course, not going as good as well as it should be, but not completely destroyed. And some of the military-industrial complex, which also generates some demand, though a very limited one compared to the Soviet period. But generally, we need less education for less industry and for less development, right? There is no strategy for development. You don't need scientists, you don't need researchers, you don't need scholars. So you cut funding. And then finally, there are some, projects which are presented just as a show-up approach, right? Show-up projects. They have this Skolkovo Center where they are trying to present a very good image of Russia, saying that Russia is still strong in science and so on. It's all about public relations. It's not about actual research. It's about public relations, pretending that they do research. And of course, there is always the capacity to, this is very important, essential in Russia, if there is a possibility to steal money from the projects. If this project is inefficient, you can steal more money out of this project, clearly. The less efficient the project, the easier it is to steal from it. And that's why they have to make all projects inefficient. I just remember I had quite a few projects which I tried to make work with government funding, and every time they said your projects are too cheap and there is no money which can be, as they said, diverted from it. So if you cannot divert money from a project makes no value. So in that sense, science as a struggle to acquire knowledge makes just no sense for this kind of elite, which is generated by this kind of capitalism.
Okay, thank you. I hear another question from a Taiwanese friend, Mrs. Wang. He made the question is this. I read here. You can find it. How do you perceive the role of leftist artists in the socialist revolution? For instance, the myriads of the slogans and advertisement that Mayakovsky made for the Soviet press factories. Shall we perceive them as a part of his art creations, like his other poems and plays, or not? When revolution rings in the air, shall all creative actions taken by artists always resonate with it?
This is great question. Yeah. This is great question, and really this is not question, this is comment, and very important comment. I'm very glad that you mentioned Mayakovsky, who is really great actor of revolution not only in 1917, of course, but revolution as process of creation of socialism. His role was, it's difficult to overestimate. And when we have a cultural form of social creativity and social creativity in the sphere of culture, this is the best result which we can only have. And if you want, I can address you to my wife, Professor Lyudmila Bulavka. She wrote a big number of texts about Mayakovsky, and I think you find very good opportunities for dialogue. I wrote my email for everybody in the chat, so you can uh, just look and write the letter. In English, unfortunately, I cannot read and write Chinese.
Okay. For me, I think that the Russian socialist culture or the communist culture is including the Mayakovsky or any other avant-gardes and the realists was so important. And in the just I got chance to visit in New York that the exhibition. I think it's in 1992, immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they organized a great exhibition entitled The Great Utopia to talk about the Soviet, the avant-gardes. Of course, that on one side was try to contrast with the socialist realism, but on the other hand, they define it as a utopia. So, but that culture, even the avant-garde culture, from my point of view, is the real nature of that arts was the real action practice, not the utopia, not only the utopian, but really engage in the social struggles, and that's why these are part of the social creativity issue. So that's the my maybe superficial observation about that because I'm a layman in the Russian cultures. But any questions we can, for the further discussion, we can open for the audience.
There is one more question in the chat about balance of power between men and women. So
Okay. Oh, here.
Comment this question. Person who wrote the question said that I am wrong not to mention about this question. I agree. Really, one of the main results of the social policy of Soviet Union was growth of the role of women in all spheres of the life, starting from economic and political, and including cultural and ideological sphere. And now in Russia, we have some forms of formal equality. I'm sorry to repeat two times forms of formal, but this is really forms and formal equality of men and women. And really, because of the social injustice, woman is in the difficult situation. We don't have enough subsidies and free time when woman is pregnant, and so many other forms of discrimination. But here I also want to stress that in our country we have a lot of forms of, let's say, liberal feminism, which tries to show only formal aspects of equality and to make women looks like men, not to create equal opportunities for development, but to create formal image of the equality. And I think struggle against this formal equality, formal feminism is also important for the left. Because you know, there are some specific features of men and women, and art shows this in many wonderful aspects. And it's not a question to be the same. It's a question to have equal rights and equal economic and political rights. That's, I think, key question of left feminism, socialist feminism. So I'm sorry not to mention this, but I also didn't mention many other questions which are important for me, such as control from masses. I agree, not from below, from masses. This is great correction. Thank you, Professor Hubank, and some others. So thank you for this question.
Yeah, and also I thank for these questions and maybe our footnotes in the Chinese revolutionary cultures. The role of woman was very important. If you look at the revolutionary model drama, so many heroes or heroines were really the woman issue. So the woman, I think in Chinese, the 妇女, all the youth, 青年, and all these categories were political subject, was not only the social, just the gender issue, but also trying to politicize it, forgive them the real social subjectivity. And that was also part of why that in that the 20th century, the woman issue is so important. So that's, and also great achievements. That's why in that social conditions. Yeah, please.
I have to, well, do you hear me? Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just I have to leave very soon because we have an important meeting tonight and I have to be there. Just because of the upcoming elections, though, I don't think we have to take them too seriously, but at least there is yet another kind of space for struggle, another field for struggle. We have to understand that in a certain sense, the legacy of the revolution is not necessarily always our asset. It can as well be our liability, in the sense that it's not because of the values. I'm not about values. I'm thinking about social structures. Social structures change. Social structures change. The structure of labor force changed. And in that sense, the basic contradiction between capital and labor remains in place. And as long as capitalism exists, there is no way it can be overcome. But the form in which this contradiction expresses itself, the form in which this basic contradiction develops itself, changes. And it is very different. And very often the language of the left, which keeps referring to the revolutions of the past, is kind of reflecting us the experience of the generals who are still trying to prepare for the previous war, for the past war, in the sense that exactly the social groups are the ones who are least interested and least capable of understanding our today's rhetoric and our ways of presenting our cause, because we still speak the language not only of the 20th century, but sometimes of the 19th century. And then what we need is a very specific, very concrete social analysis, which deals with the demands and needs of specific social groups, of which the modern proletariat objectively is composed, and demands and show that current capitalism, current form of capitalism at least, is not capable of responding to these demands and needs. This is where the real revolutionary potential emerges. And only once these groups are already involved in the process of struggle, then, only then, you can kind of address to the tradition of the Russian Revolution, or point to that tradition saying, well, look, this is where we started. This is where it all comes from. And this is where the tradition begins. And then only at this point, one can really make this continuity working successfully. Because otherwise, we are very often kind of reminding people who are doing historic reconstructions, pretending to play the role of, say, Jacobins or Bolsheviks or whoever. And of course, some of this reconstruction can be even positive in terms of generating some enthusiasm and some cultural inspiration. but we should not overestimate the importance of culture.
Okay, thanks. Alexander, have you seen the further questions about the Alexander block? And I think the crucial question is, do you find the revolution and the messianic thoughts that prevailed in Russia during the late 19th century? I think this is a real question, the crucial question. He also talked about the block and the 12, the long point.
First of all, I want to say hello to Boris, and his addition was extremely important. We are really working in many aspects together. So I will not repeat what he said. He made another, he showed another aspect of the problem. So about Alexander Blok, this is great poem. If anybody didn't read the 12, you must do this. And better, of course, in Russian, but in any case, this is really great. Revolution is not a result of messianic approach of anybody. Evolution is objective process. If you want objective storm, which was inspired by objective contradictions. And this is storm of masses. I will not say more below, but storm of masses who really creating new society by their own hands, brains, hearts, will, and so on. That's why it is not messianic approach. Why Blok said about Jesus in front of the seamen who are in front of revolutionary people. So this is question to Alexander Blok, not to Alexander BUZGALIN, of course. I think that for many intellectuals, especially who came from the art and symbolism of Silver Age, such approach from the point of view of the person who see himself or who see anybody as Messiah was the only variant to understand revolution. I'm not sure that Blok was the only, was the person who had the only such approach, because he also wrote very important words. When peasants are coming to palace of Khan, palace of aristocrats, and destroying libraries, they are fighting not against books, not against culture. They are fighting against the building where during 200, 300, 400 years, their mothers and fathers were exploited by these aristocrats. And he understood this energy which is coming from the masses. Maybe it was symbol of combination of intellectual, messianic, poetic approach of Blok with revolutionary of masses, maybe. But again, I'm not specialist in this sphere. I simply like this.
There was another question here. Have you seen these questions? The legacies of USSR are in dispute. The day of Nazi invasion of USSR today was mentioned, Putin and other political sectors, which isn't communist dispute this memory, how the socialist sectors react to its moment. This is one question. Then the constitutional referendum in 2020 have points to reform in constitution of Boris Yeltsin in 1993. How do you see this process in 2020? What legacies of social fight those or no?
First of all, it's a very important question and very complex. I try to comment, not give the lecture. I like to present lectures. I'm professor, but I try not to do this. So, first of all, about real patriotism and formal patriotism, which we have in our country. We have a very unusual for 21st century from one hand and very typical for 21st century from another hand trend. This is conservative trend. A few years ago, we were thinking that 21st century will never put us back to feudalism, to the questions about empires and so on. But we received this. This agenda became typical for United States, for the United States, for Russia. I don't know about China really, but in our country, this is a very big question. And we received very interesting phenomena. From one hand, our conservative forces, bourgeois conservative forces, very strange mixture of feudal traditions and bourgeois liberal traditions, they are using a memory about victory in the Second World War, in Great Patriotic War for us, for Soviet people. They're trying to use this memory in order to increase respect to their power. Putin and other people understood that Russian people, not only in Russia, people really respect the heroic result, really love this victory. For us, this is extremely big event in the world history. And they are exploiting this phenomenon. Some of them are really, how to say, they are not telling lie, but they are trying to close eyes and not to explain to people that it is impossible to integrate all country for the victory and have a bourgeois capitalist system like we have now in Russia. Putin and some other specialists in ideology and propaganda, they don't mention this question. And for many people now, in many brains, we have a very strange mixture of feelings of ourselves as citizens of the Soviet Union and as citizens of Russia, and especially for old generation. For the left, victory in the Second World War and heroic decisions of our parents, of our grandfathers and grandmothers, and maybe grandfathers and grandmothers, is a basis to show that socialist basis, economic basis, socialist collectivity, solidarity, and Communist Party as vanguard of the struggle really was extremely big factor, maybe the biggest, the main factor of the victory. What we are trying to show that during World War II, communism defeat fascism, not tanks, not airplanes, not guns, but communist behavior of millions defeated defeated fascism in all over the world, because it was all Europe who were occupied and determined by by fascism, including Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, all Europe. So this is our feeling of the events. And also it was question about students and modern generation in Russia. What are their feelings about Westernization and the relations between Russia and the West? So very briefly, we have different students and we have big contradiction in our education in universities. We have education for masses, I can say, which has not very good quality, but still not bad, and free of charge mainly. And we have elite or quasi-elite education, where we have American-style textbooks in economics, American-style textbooks in politics, in sociology, in philosophy. And the second type of students really wants to have Russia as colony of the United States, because from their point of view, they will be among people working in colonial administration, not like ordinary Russians. They mainly participated in protest actions of liberals, which we had in our country, but not only. There are some other questions, but I don't know if we have more time, and maybe everybody are tired because we are talking more than 2 hours now. So please, Professor, I'm in your hands. So if I have to answer, I am glad. If we have to finish, I will say thank you so much for a very interesting discussion.
So according to the arrangement of schedule, we still have some time for the further discussion. Here, the Kimchi, can you raise your question yourself?
Okay, so I'd like to ask about the discussions among economists or among the left about the orientation, whether there could be alternative economic orientation that would not be reliant on, well, export of raw materials or, well, so that they would go for more self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And then, of course, if we talk about self-reliance, then the question of agriculture would be predominant. So could you also say something about the agrarian issues in Russia, especially on agriculture and the peasantry?
I will start from the last part of your question and comment briefly problems in the agrarian sector. Russia had problems in agriculture during all history, partly because of the climate. We have very bad soil and we have very continental climate, and sometimes we don't have rain and it's extremely hot. Now in Russia we have plus 35, which is very unusual for our country. Sometimes in the summer it will be plus 15 and raining for the months. Yeah, so it's very bad for agriculture and problems were typical for all period. Now we have contradictions as in all other spheres. From one hand, our government made a few steps which can be estimated as positive. It was, let's say, 80% of negative and 20% of positive. Among this 20% of positive was relatively strong support to agrarian industry, not agriculture itself, but production of machines and all other necessary elements for agrarian production. And state gave very cheap credits. It was big investments and other forms of support. And now we received some positive trends in agrarian sector. We have small growth, +1, +2% in average, but this is better than in other branches of economy. From another point of view, in agrarian sector, we have over concentration of production under the supervision of big corporations. Part of them has status of formally state, but really they are controlled by regional bureaucracy and working not for the society, not for the people, but for this regional bureaucracy. And partly this is private big corporations who control agriculture. Plus, we have a lot of problems with realization of agrarian production. In between agrarian producer and consumer, we have a lot of different corporations, networks, trade corporations, and so on. That's why we have very low incomes of agrarian workers and very high prices in the shops, in the supermarkets. The prices in Russian supermarkets, prices on food, are more or less the same like in Europe. And peasants in Russia are maybe 10 times, have 10 times less incomes than in Europe. So this is another contradiction. A few words, I said a few words about agrarian situation, about economy in general. We have very deep discussion between mainstream economists. What is interesting, inside mainstream economists, we have big discussion. One part of economists support very monetarist, far-right neoliberal approach. This deregulation, strong fiscal policy, no social spendings, and so on. Another part is supporting more neo-Keynesian, not even neo-Keynesian, post-Keynesian trends, and supports ideas of strong state regulation, even plans, and strong industrial policy. 3 months ago, we had conference devoted to the 100th anniversary of Gosplan, of planning in our country. And big part of top economists, academicians, leaders of universities, economic departments of universities, and so on, supported the idea of necessity of planning and strong industrial policy for rebirth of Russian high-tech production, Russian high-tech industry, education, healthcare system, and education and science.
Okay, here another question from Professor Pietri Spiso. Can you see that you coordinated the Russian Social Forum, which nowadays is in a sort of crisis? Do you think that we need to think of a new form of international social institution to be able to create new alternatives, real alternatives? All the main struggle should be at the national level. I think this is a really also very important question.
I completely agree. That is really very important question. And for me personally, very important, because I participated in World Social Forums from 2001. So it's now 20th anniversary of my being in this process, and was one of the members of Organization Committee for European Social Forums and one of the organizers of Russian Social Forum. So I'm absolutely sure that it must be international process. And this year in January took place World Social Forum. Unfortunately, it was online, but in some aspects, fortunately, because many Russian social activists could participate in these discussions. We had up to 10 different events with participation of Russian people. But what is more important, renovation of World Social Forum and maybe re-establishing of continental social forums in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, and the forums devoted to concrete questions like education or social justice, environment. We have even the network, which is working, discussing questions of renovation of World Social Forum and establishing of more active, more working, and more organized institutions inside World Social Forum. If you don't have information about this initiative, I send you email and contacts of this network. And key idea is to have inside World Social Forum, which is extremely pluralistic, extremely democratic, but cannot work as organization, to create the core, more, maybe a little bit less democratic, at least less formally democratic, but more organized for practical work. In some aspects, I can say more Bolsheviks, but this is big discussion. You know about social forum, it was a good joke, which is which can work in English. World Social Forum is very important as an initiative, but politically it is impotent. Unfortunately, yeah. I will not agree that it is impotent, because the forum initiated a lot of very important campaigns, but still it is not a political force. And we need political force and international political force.
Okay, are there any new questions here? There were new questions from here. Does the revolution after sacrifice bring about change in human nature or change in social structure, or change in human nature through changes in social structure? Because we all know that the human nature change is difficult. It can depend on the social structure. So this is a question for you again.
Very interesting questions. It's a great dialogue. I'm happy to be with you, honestly. I'm smiling all the time. Questions are not very optimistic and problems are very deep, but it's very good that we have such dialogue, transcontinental in some aspects. So about the question, I think that Marx's theory of 20th century, not exactly Marx, but Marx's theory of 20th century, including Soviet Marxism, critical Soviet Marxism, showed that man or human being, I don't know what is better in English, let's say man, man has contradiction. From one hand, man is a function, marionette of the social forces, institutions. He's slave of market, slave of state, slave of feudal relations, capitalist relations, and so on. But from another hand, man is creator of the history. He is subject of social creativity. And this is two parts of one nature of man, one nature of human being. This contradiction is the basis for development. And in revolution, we had the interesting transformation of these two aspects of contradiction. First step, I just say hello to my colleagues. During revolution was the result of contradictions inside bourgeois, semi-feudal, semi-bourgeois Russian society, which created new type of man who was ready to be revolutionary, who was ready to start revolutionary actions. It was objective result of contradictions of Russian Empire. But from another point of view, this man, woman, everybody who participated in the revolution became creators of new society. They created new forms of social organization, economic organization, political life, cultural life, and so on. And these new forms of economic social life generated new type of personality, generated socialist personality. And in Soviet Union, we had the contradiction between, let's say, old personality, conformist, product of capitalism, feudalism, product of thousands of, I don't know, ages and ages and ages of social alienation, product of alienation from one hand, and product of socialist relations, social creator from another hand. And this struggle of socialist men and conformist men was one of the key contradictions of Soviet Union. And finally, conformists defeated socialist men. We received counter-revolution. And now we have determination of man by capitalism and feudalism, Russian-style capitalism. One time I said, we have in Russia Jurassic Park of capitalism with huge monsters, the state-private corporations who dominate our life. And these monsters dominate our life, and they created this personality who is semi-slave, I don't know, small bourgeois, who is trying to maximize income, to have more money, to have more commodities, to have brands, but who is in reality in the poverty and determined by bureaucracy and top business. From another hand, these contradictions will again create new personality who is fighter and who will be even more strong fighter against this system. So this is dialectic generated by contradiction of man as creator and as function of social relations.